um, uh, the strong behaving badly to the weak. And one has to see slavery was appalling. But in my view, you have to see slavery in the context of that, going back to the Romans and the Greeks and so on. Anyway, my Bloomberg editor said, would you mind if we left that bit out? Because it's a trigger issue and you really want that much aggravation.
Well, and I will say now we are streaming now live on YouTube and Facebook. And I want to say hi to Percy Smith and give him a special welcome because he's coming to us all the way from Vancouver. Do you hear us, Percy? Good to see you. Thank you very much. I know it's early in the morning in Vancouver. Ray, you're Montreal?
No, Ray is in the Toronto area with me.
Ray is Toronto. Hugh, you're Montreal.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us at this early hour. We're very grateful that you'll share some of your experiences with us. I know we have the Merchant Marine is in the United States is a huge subject of interest to people who are, literate on the history of World War II. And I think it's because for so long, we didn't hear much about the Merchant Marine. And certainly in the United States, we don't hear much about the Canadian equivalent of the Merchant Marine. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to Mr. Masters.
Yes.
My pleasure as always.
Once we start, Todd, why don't you just give a little introduction about Veterans Breakfast Club, if you would.
Will do.
All right. And Max, the structure of the program is we're going to start with you for 45 minutes. And then once we're finished, you're welcome to stay on if you have the time and the interest. Scott is then going to conduct the interviews with the three Merchant Marine veterans that he's been able to find.
Now that's great. You fire away when you're ready.
Okay. I will just do as quick an introduction as I can so that we could get right to the program.
All right. And I have 9 o'clock, so I will start the theme music and start letting people in.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our VBC Greatest Generation Live. This is the first time that we're ever having our Greatest Generation Live program on a Monday morning. And I know some of you who are out west, like Percy Smith, Merchant Marine veteran in Vancouver, this is very early indeed. For others, like Sir Max Hastings, it's later in the day. He's coming to us, I believe, from Britain. I see we have Mark Gleason on, another Merchant Marine veteran from World War II. Thank you for joining us, Mark. I appreciate that very much.
Good morning.
Gunter, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us again. I look forward to having Gunter on some other time again to share more of his remarkable story. I'm just digging into his book. But for those of you who are here with us with the Veterans Breakfast Club for the first time, I do want to introduce myself. I'm Todd DiPastino. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we are a nonprofit that started here in Pittsburgh in 2008, informally getting some veterans together. At the time, it was World War II veterans, just to share a little bit of their stories with the public. It started in a hotel ballroom in the South Hills of Pittsburgh with 30 World War II veterans. And since then, we've done 1,000 events where veterans can come and share their stories with the public. We do a lot of them online now ever since COVID. And it's been wonderful because we've been able to have people like Sir Max Hastings join us. We wouldn't have been able to do unless we could coax them to Pittsburgh for an early morning on a Friday morning or something like that. And so that is our mission as a nonprofit, is to bring veterans together with the public and have them share stories. And this is our Greatest Generation Live program, hosted by Glenn Flickinger, who's a board member of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And we have some new sponsors for our live programs here. And they're not with us this morning, but we've just confirmed that tobacco-free Adagio Health is going to be a sponsor for this program and for many of our programs all throughout the year. And we're very grateful to be partnering with them on helping to prevent and reduce tobacco use in the US. And then we have D&D Auto Salvage, who's coming back with us for to be a sponsor. And so we'll be hearing more from D&D Auto, as well as Tobacco-Free Adagio Health in the coming weeks. I want to make this very quick because I want to get right on to the program. But I do want to remind people that we also have a program tonight. This is a double header tonight. So we have this morning and tonight. Originally, we had Paul Hauser scheduled with us, and it was all going to be about the United States Air Force weapons control. But due to illness, we're postponing it. Paul will be back with us at another date. And I'm really grateful to George Cohn, who's a F-4 Phantom fighter pilot, flew 207 missions in Vietnam in 1968, 1969. He's going to come and share his story. I have just started reading his memoir, which is phenomenally written. I'm a writer. I'm always offended when I read non-professional writers whose writing is just as good as mine. And so I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. He should stay out of the writing business because he's too good. But it really is. It's a very effective memoir. And then Wednesday morning, we have a remarkable program called Vietnam Graffiti. It's about this ship, the General Nelson M. Walker, and the graffiti it was one of the few troop ships that was used over and over again for the Vietnam War. And I think the entire 4th Division maybe went on the ship to Vietnam, and it was just strewn with graffiti. And Art and Lee Beltrone went through it and preserved all the graffiti on the ship, and it now travels as an exhibit. I've seen the exhibit. We're going to have somebody, Joe Corrigan, who contributed to that graffiti, as well as Art Beltrone, join us on Wednesday morning. So please do join us for Wednesday morning, January 12th at 9 a.m. And tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern for our VBC happy hour. And now I'm going to throw it to Glenn. Thank you, Glenn, for giving me that time to make an introduction.
Absolutely no problem. Thank you, Todd. Okay, so I'm Glenn Flickinger. For the Veterans Breakfast Club, I'm the host and producer of Greatest Generation Live, where we obviously focus on World War II. And today we're thrilled, in fact, honored to have Sir Max Hastings as our guest. I'm going to read just a little bit about Max's, and we sort of cleared that up early on with Max. It's okay to call him Max from the American point of view. Let me read just a little bit about Max Hastings. I've taken from his official biography. Couldn't read it all, otherwise I don't think we'd have enough time to interview. So Sir Max Hastings is an author, journalist, broadcaster whose work has appeared in every British national newspaper. He's a columnist now for the Times of London and from Bloomberg. He has published 29 books, the most recent of which are Vietnam, An Epic History, The Secret War, Spies, Codes, and Guerrillas, Catastrophe, About the Great War, 1914, Finest Years, Churchill as Warlord, one of my favorites. He was educated at Charterhouse and University College, Oxford. And I have to say, I didn't know this about you, Max, where you dropped out to become a journalist. In 67, 68, he worked in the United States, winning a World Press Institute Fellowship, which expired his first book, America, 1968, The Fire This Time. So I'll stop there because, like I said, I think we'd take up the next half hour if I went through all of it. But Max, we're thrilled to have you on. Thank you very much for joining.
No, well, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction, Glenn. The stuff you're reading is just a catalogue of my mistakes.
I wouldn't say that.
No, but anyway, cut to the chase. I know what you want to talk about is Operation Pedestal and the events of the Second World War.
Right. Let me just first ask, because I love to understand how authors like you got started. Okay. And Operation Pedestal is a book I read of yours last summer. And I'm just thrilled that we were able to connect and have this on. But it just hit me, just really floored me that you dropped out to become a journalist. Can you just give us a little background as to what happened to you as a young man?
I grew up as maybe you did, and a lot of other people on both sides of the pond, I grew up in a very macho, male-dominated household in which all the men claimed to have enjoyed the Second World War. And my father and my uncles and my cousins, they all banged on about what a fantastic time they'd had. And it took my mother, who was a very smart woman, and also had no patience with my father's storytelling, to say, she said, don't you listen for a minute to all the nonsense your father and Uncle Lewis and so on are talking. The Second World War was hell from beginning to end for everybody. The separations and the darkness and the sacrifices. And I grew up as a teenager, very much under the shadow of the war. And in Britain around us, an old World War II airfield where actually American troops had been stationed was a couple of miles up the road, and there were innumerable beside our house in London. There was just a huge empty space which had been bombed by the Nazis and so on. And so the shadow of the war was very long. And I had a picture of the war in the immediate as a child, which was rather romantic and glamorous. And I had ideas about what wars are like, that if you like, I've spent the rest of my life learning to understand a little bit better. One of the things that to me is most important and is directly relevant to what we're talking about today and the Merchant Marine is that when I started out, I thought wars are about soldiers. I thought they're about heroes and they're about the people who fight enemies on the battlefield. And the longer I've studied wars and the more one's come to understand that soldiers are in some ways the least interesting people who participate in wars, because very young men, many of them don't find it too difficult to be brave, to be a bit brave anyway. They don't think a lot, because when you're young, none of us do think a lot. I've learned to think much more about victims, that most of the people who die in all wars are not soldiers. They're not brave young men. They're not Audie Murphy. They're people who, whether they like it or not, have got dragged into this thing, especially women and kids. And especially, if you like, people in the Merchant Marine, many of them over age, who are civilians, who haven't the slightest desire to get caught up in a war and suddenly finding themselves doing so. And it's the experiences of those people. My books, as the years have gone by, focus more and more on the victims, on the people who got caught up in this whole thing. There are enough books about the heroes. I've written myself about the Audie Murphys and the RAF hero Guy Gibson, all the rest of it. So it's not that I'm undervaluing them. Of course, every nation needs these people, but there are millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people who get caught up in this stuff, especially in world wars, who I think the last generation of historians didn't pay enough attention to. And when I wrote my book about the Vietnam War, I spent as much time talking to Vietnamese people about their experiences as I did talking to Vietnamese soldiers and American soldiers who fought in Vietnam. So I would say I'm now 76. How old are you?
68.
Yeah, well, you're a young thing. But now that I'm the age I am, I feel, I won't say that I've got wise, because none of us really get wise, or not many of us. But I do think my whole perception of wars has changed. And when I think that as a kid, I grew up, I remember saying, as a kid, I thought my father brought me up to believe I was terribly unlucky to have grown up too young to have participated in the Second World War, to have had all the fun he claimed to have had. And of course, all this is bullshit. We are incredibly lucky that we haven't had to go through what, as you so rightly say, the greatest generation did.
Yeah. It's 100% accurate, those observations, obviously, Max. So tell us, of all the books you've written, I think this is the first book I can remember of yours that gets involved with the Royal Navy, and certainly with the Merchant Marine. Why this book? What attracted you to this topic, and how did you get to this topic?
I'm always trying to think, before I write any book, what can I tell people that will surprise them that they didn't know already? Where's the gee whiz factor? And this does not mean producing dark secrets. because any new book about World War II, especially, that says, great revelations, here is the story that really defeated Hitler, this is all bullshit. Throw those books straight in the dustbin, because I don't believe on our side of the wire anyway, possibly in the Soviet archives, but on Western archives, I don't believe there are any great secrets. But a lot of stuff went on that people under-recognize. And I personally, having studied both the United States, well, every aspect of World War II for so many years, I've come to believe that just as the United States Navy was America's greatest fighting service, so I believe the Royal Navy was Britain's. And the Royal Navy has had rather less attention than it deserves, partly because all our admirals, except Lord Mountbatten, who was a terrific show-off and self-publicist, they hated publicity, and they didn't want it to be on the front pages. And the Royal Navy always believed that one should fight one's battles very quietly and just tell everybody afterwards who won. And it was just the same. The last job I did as a journalist, I went as a correspondent to the Falklands in 1982. Little war, but in a sort of microcosm, not totally unlike some of the World War II naval battles. And the Royal Navy did not want to take any correspondence at all to the South Atlantic. It wanted to go down there, fight the Argentines, and then announce afterwards who'd won. And eventually the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, did convince the Navy that whether they liked it or not, they got to take some correspondence. And so I was one of a very small number who went. And of course, it was an extraordinary experience. And in some ways, it was a sort of microcosm of those World War II naval battles, because one saw ships sunk by air attack. One saw ships sinking, which is quite a scary sight. I'd never seen a ship sink before 1982. And you saw people, it was a bit like a sort of bad British 1950s movie, the Falklands. I remember at one point, I was standing on the shore at San Carlos in the Falklands beside a Royal Marine as we watched Argentine aircraft attack and sink a British landing ship. And the Royal Marine standing next to me, he said, "Cool," he said, "if it goes on like this, we're going to have to get the Yanks down here to help us." And I said, "I've got to break it to you. The Yanks aren't coming. We're going to have to do this on our own." And but one saw all these scenes and people saying the sort of things they said on the pedestal convoy, that as radar reported an Argentine naval attack coming in, that the captain of the frigate with whom I was on that occasion, and he said, "Right, chaps," he said, "remember, when they come, give them hell." And of course, it's a very boring, cliched thing to say. But of course, he'd been brought up on all these black and white 1950s movies. And so he'd learned his script from all this. And another captain, during another air attack, I remember hearing him say to his bridge, this is a guy called Jeremy Larkin, on the captain of the command ship, Fearless. And after it had been near miss, Jeremy turned to the bridge and he said, "Well, there's only one thing to be said for all this when it's over and they make the movie. There will be no part whatsoever for Robert Redford." And our Canadian navigating officer put his hand up and said, "What about me?" And all these jokes, all I'm saying in a very small way, you can never compare World War II to anything that happened to the post-war generation. But you did get a flavor of those things. You did see stuff happening that happened on an incomparably larger scale,
right?
In World War II. So it helped a bit.
So Max, help us understand, not only is the Merchant Marine underappreciated, but for most people, certainly in the States, the Mediterranean theater of war is underappreciated. Most Americans kind of think it was D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and then we were done. So why was Malta so important that the British Navy, Winston Churchill, et cetera, decided to mount the biggest naval expedition since, I think you said, since Jutland?
It was.
Why was Malta so important?
Sorry. That the Mediterranean, if you look at the grand picture of World War II from where we're standing, was not very important, because the big stuff was happening on the Russian front. where the Russians were deciding the course of the war by eventually defeating the Wehrmacht after suffering 27 million casualties, 27 million dead. And the Mediterranean at one level was a sideshow, but on the other hand, it was very important in a number of ways. One is, it was in 1941-42, the only significant battle the British were fighting. And the Americans were fighting in the Pacific. Midway was being fought and so on. But in the Western theater, there was no other game in town. And people have no understanding of the fact that Winston Churchill's personal position was far more vulnerable in 1942 than it was in 1940. That Malta was this little island being bombed relentlessly from Italy and from Sicily and from North Africa, and 300,000 civilians and a relatively small British garrison. And a lot of people back in Britain thought the best thing to do would be to let the Axis take it over. But what's the point hanging on to it? It was being bombed. Sicily, the German and Italian airfields on Sicily were only about 15 minutes flying time away. They were able to keep hammering and hammering at Malta. And people said back in Britain, admirals and generals, well, why are we going on with this nonsense? Why don't we just admit we can't hold Malta and hand it over? And if the Russians win in the east, if they hold out, which a lot of people thought they wouldn't, then Malta doesn't matter one way or the other. And Churchill alone, and very strongly against the wishes of his admirals, he said, we've got to hold this island. Why? Partly because it wasn't only Stalin and the Russians who were wondering if the British were serious about the war anymore. So was the United States. That it's fascinating to study American opinion polls from 1942. And about June 42, a big opinion poll, a Gallup poll, asked Americans who they thought was trying hardest to win the war. Not surprisingly, about 85% said the United States. After that, about, I'm getting the numbers slightly wrong, but said a lot of people said the Russians. After that, they said the Chinese. And the British, only 6% of Americans responding to that opinion poll thought the British were trying hardest to win the war. They thought they'd seen the British lose Malaya, lose Singapore, lose these battleships off Malaya. They'd seen them thrashed again and again by a smaller German army in the desert. And a lot of Americans were saying to each other, who are these people we've gone into bed with? Who are these British allies? Do they have any idea of how to fight a war? Well, first of all, Churchill understood it was vital to give the people of the United States and the Russians an earnest of the fact that the British were not frightened of taking casualties and could fight. And secondly, and this was came a little bit later, but was also important. In 1942, early 1942, the American Chiefs of Staff, George Marshall, the US Army, they wanted to get on in there and take on the Germans in France. They wanted a D-Day in 1942. And they thought the British were pathetic not to be willing to get into that.
Right.
And the British, having been trashed again and again by the Germans, knew that the Germans were very, very difficult people to fight. And what the Mediterranean did in 1942-43, first of all, it was the one theater in which the Western Allies were fighting the Germans. Secondly, it taught the United States a lot about just how difficult it was to fight the Germans, which was very important because after the American army had lost a few battles, they too understood why the British had found it pretty tough. And they understood they needed quite a lot of practice before they took on the main German army in Northwest Europe. And thirdly, sorry.
No, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Thirdly, Churchill needed that success, that Malta become a symbol. He had told everybody, the British people, the American people, the Russians, that Malta was the bastion of democracy in the middle of the Mediterranean. So he decrees that this huge task force, nearly 100 ships all told, 14 merchant ships, but best part of 70 or 80 escorts headed by 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, all to take this convoy right under the Germans and Italians' noses through the Mediterranean. The admirals thought it was madness. They thought this was crazy. They said the danger we're going to lose. Britain had only 7 aircraft carriers, and you're putting 4 of them in the Mediterranean. Churchill said it's got to be done. And so they went. And the story was an extraordinary, it was an epic, as we've been saying, not only for the Royal Navy, but for the Merchant Navy. And those guys of the Merchant Navy who were being paid next to nothing, who got none of the glory and far fewer of the decorations. And over the days of those battles, and especially the pedestal convoy, 1,000 miles to Malta, the first day was okay. After that, the second day, they lose an aircraft carrier. The third and fourth days, they take the thrashing of a lifetime. And the fifth day, they finally get through with the best of these ships, the last of these ships, through to Malta, just enough to keep Malta fed. And this American-built tanker, the Ohio, which of course is one of the great sagas of the war, after being bombed and torpedoed again and again and again with crashed German aircraft on its deck, the ruin of the Ohio, finally makes it to Malta, almost sinking. And as it's dragged by 2 destroyers into the Grand Harbor in Malaya, in Malta, the poor old ship finally slumps the last few feet onto the bottom of the harbor in Malta. But it doesn't matter because most of the oil's still there and so on. So it's one of the great epic sagas. But the reason everybody tends to be most interested, as you said, in the Bulge and in the later battles, everybody wants to hear about all the battles we won. Well, what we have to remember is that the pedestal story took place when nobody knew what we knew. We know that we won. We know that Hitler lost. In August 1942, a lot of people were not nearly so sure of that. So this terrific battle took place. It was not as important as Midway. Midway was one of the decisive, probably the decisive naval battle of the Second World War. But it was pretty important. And reading about what those guys did, both the civilians of the Merchant Navy and of the Royal Navy, you probably want to burst into tears.
Right, right. Let me put up a map of the convoy. Ellie or Todd, can you give me the host so I can put this map up?
Yeah, you should be co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, give me just a second here. Let me expand this. Okay, is everybody seeing that?
Yeah.
There we go. Max, can you see that map?
You bet.
Okay, so if my pointer works here, right?
Well, of course, the first one is Eagle, the carrier,
right
the old carrier, which this was the second day after they passed the Straits of Gibraltar. And Eagle, everybody was feeling, they were feeling quite cocky because a few German and Italian aircraft had appeared overhead and the terrific barrage from the fleet had appeared to push them off without too much trouble. And a pilot who was taking off from one of the other carriers, he suddenly saw all the ground crew that on the flight deck of his own carrier pointing and gesturing, and they suddenly see 300 or 400 yards away, they see this other big carrier, Eagle. It's been hit wham, 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 4 torpedoes from a German submarine that had crept in between the escorts, even with all these 40-odd escorts around the merchant vessels. This U-73 had got in there. It had fired a salvo of 4 torpedoes at almost point-blank range. And Eagle, it began to turn turtle. And a pilot on Eagle who survived, and he said afterwards that one of the most terrible noises he heard in the whole war was as he and all the others were desperately struggling to get up on the deck and get into the sea before the carrier went under. And they heard these terrible screams and shouts from down below in the engine room, because it was always the engine room crews who suffered the worst casualties. And Eagle turned turtle and went under in 8 minutes. And it is pretty spooky to think of this huge carrier taking with it all these aircraft that went under so quickly. But I go back to the engine room crews. About 200 or 300 men died aboard Eagle, and most of them, as always, were the engine room crews. And how you got people to serve in the engine rooms of either merchant vessels or warships, knowing that almost always, in almost every sinking, most of the losses were in the engine rooms, because the poor guys doing these vital jobs, their chances of getting out were the worst.
Yeah. So let me frame this question, Max, because as I read the book, I kept asking this question to myself. The convoy and the merchant ships continue on. And of course, as they get into these more narrow waters, it gets worse and worse because
of course, because they're being, you've only got to look at the map to see that the Germans and the Italians had air bases on Sardinia and Sicily.
Right.
And they were getting closer and closer, so that it was only a few minutes flying time. And sorry, yeah.
No, my question is, the British naval forces, as they got into these narrows, kept leaving the convoy, kept leaving the merchant ships, right?
They had to go. What they did, the decision they did make, although Churchill had insisted that these carriers and the battleships accompanied the force. Churchill had forced the admirals to accept this view, but when they got into the so-called Sicilian Narrows, which is about in the middle of your map, or just to the right of the middle of your map,
right here.
About that sort of place where you are now, that the admiral, he'd only got two carriers, one had been sunk and one had turned back. He had two carriers, one of which was hammered terribly in a German air attack, which very nearly sank it, Indomitable. And so he got two carriers left, one of them badly damaged, and the two battleships. And the calculation was that when they were within 300 or 400 miles of Malta, it was just too dangerous in the Sicilian Narrows to leave the carriers. So they left the convoy to be escorted by destroyers and cruisers. But of course, 10 minutes after not literally 10 minutes, but about 2 hours after the battleships and the carriers turned back, an Italian submarine attacked the convoy,
right? And
it went for the warships, and it was one of the most devastating submarine attacks of the war. Everybody treats the Italians as if they were pathetic, but Italian submariners, some of them achieved amazing things. And this Italian submarine called Axum, that it launched a salvo of torpedoes. Wham! One hit a cruiser, which immediately started to sink, had to be scuttled. Wham! A second torpedo hit another cruiser, the flagship of the admiral. And although it survived, it didn't sink. It had to turn back for Gibraltar, and it was out of the battle. And wham! A third one hit the tanker Ohio, the most vital ship in the whole convoy. And this was a terrible shock. And just as the British were reeling from that shock, that suddenly another air attack came in, which sank another couple of merchant ships in the first few minutes. And I mean, the scale of the devastation, and just as darkness fell, and the British thought, oh, well, maybe they get a bit of a respite, German and Italian torpedo boats started attacking. And again, in the hours that followed, they suffered some of the heaviest losses of any force in the Second World War. That 2 or 3 more merchant ships were sunk in the space of a few minutes, and their biggest cruiser, the cruiser Manchester, hit by a torpedo. Her captain decided she had to be scuttled. This was a very interesting story, Manchester, because her captain was humane. Now, the cruiser, badly hit. It was very close to the coast of Tunisia, which was held by the Vichy French, neutral. And the captain, middle of the night, ship in a bad way, the captain of the cruiser, Manchester, decided that the only humane thing to do was to scuttle his ship and abandon it, because although it wasn't about to sink, that when dawn came, that German-Italian aircraft would almost certainly sink it, and far more lives to be lost. So the ship was abandoned, and about 700 men from Manchester made their way ashore and became prisoners of the Vichy French.
Right.
Now, this was a humane decision, and the captain was probably right that if they tried to keep Manchester going, when dawn came, they'd have been clobbered. But Churchillian crusades were not won by being humane. And as soon as the captain of that ship, a man called Harold Drew, was returned from internment by the French in 1943, he was court-martialed, and he was found guilty, probably rightly by the standards of that day, of having failed to try adequately to save his ship. And it was the same principle that a couple of hundred years before, the British had shot one of their own admirals on the decks of their ship for not trying hard enough in a battle. And I have a good deal of sympathy with the Royal Navy for that court-martial. It was a very cruel decision. But if you were trying to make sure that your officers and your captains did their absolute damnedest, then taking a very, very harsh view of anybody who didn't seem to have done his damnedest seemed very important. So it was fascinating what happened to Manchester, and what happened to Captain Drew. He never received another seagoing command.
Right, right. I love the way you put that. What was that? The Churchillian.
Churchillian crusades.
Yeah, Churchillian crusade.
Churchill himself, the whole essence of understanding Winston Churchill, who I'm so glad you like my book about Churchill, about Churchill as the warlord, because it was the book I enjoyed writing most, because writing about Churchill is so wonderful. And Churchill himself was a hero, and he could never really understand in the middle of a war why everybody else didn't want to be heroes too. And he was genuinely baffled sometimes by when British armies surrendered to smaller German or Japanese armies. And right. he was completely bemused. And certainly the episode of the Manchester and that big cruiser being scuttled when she probably could have been kept going was the sort of thing that made him really, really mad. And it's easy to understand why.
Right. Right, right. So permit me to ask you one more question, and then Todd, will see if any of our members, anybody in the audience would like to ask Max a question. So let me see here. Yeah, this is it. So
that's Ohio coming into Grand Harbor.
And I have to tell you, as I read the book, Max, it was like I was watching some British murder mystery series, waiting to get to the last episode to find out, what happened. And I'm reading this book, and I'm thinking none of these merchant vessels make it to Malta, because I didn't know the ending, right? And I think out of 14, how many made it to Malta? Just 3 or 4,
including Ohio, made it to Malta, and it was just enough to keep Malta fed through until November, when General Montgomery won the Battle of El Alamein in the desert, and then the British were able to push west, and American and British forces landed Operation Torch at the other end of North Africa, and after that they were able to supply Malta without too much trouble. But the scenes on Ohio in those last days, when she was being dragged, and I mean dragged, the last 100 miles to Malta by these 2 destroyers, and still being relentlessly air attacked. And some of the men who got aboard Ohio got at their supplies of booze, and some of the naval ratings were too drunk to stand on Ohio. And the captain of one of the destroyers, and remember, they could only drag this tanker at a speed of about 5 knots, about 5 or 6 miles an hour. And there was a sort of madness in the air. And the captain of one of these destroyers had a gramophone put on the bridge, and he played over the broadcast system the most upbeat record he got in his collection, which is Glenn Miller's Chattanooga Choo Choo. And it was about the only record he had. So they played Chattanooga Choo Choo again and again and again. And it's an incredibly moving saga. And there were a number of American survivors from sunk merchant ships who were on board those ships, and actually a number of them manned guns on Ohio through the last few miles. It's an incredibly moving saga, and they shouldn't have gotten away with it. They, by all the rights, not only the tanker, but the destroyers should have been sunk. But it was a tribute, and I've said this in the book, to American technology, that although Ohio had a British crew on that voyage, that this was Ohio and Kentucky were the two strongest built ships of their kind in the world, built in American shipyards. And I've said in my book that it was a classic case of the contribution that American technological and production skills made to the winning of the war, a staggering contribution that no other ship afloat could have survived what Ohio survived, because Ohio was so brilliantly compartmentalized.
And what was fascinating to me, Max, is that literally once it's docked, or even perhaps here, they are pumping out the fuel as it sinks, as it in its final throes. And that in all of that, given the technology, all of those attacks, they were able to, although the whole ship was a wreck above the water.
Well, they had two shot down German planes on the deck. I mean, the whole thing was a shambles.
Yeah.
It was, but there was a sort of madness, but it was a wonderful madness about the whole story.
Yeah, yeah. So at this point, given the time here, Todd,
yeah, I've got to leave you quite soon.
Fine.
Any questions? Any questions for Sir Max Hastings? When is the movie coming out?
I'm not sure there are enough Americans in it. You've got to have a part for Redford if you want to get the movie
Right,
made.
right. Well, we can do that. We can do that. Mark Gleason, do you have any comments or questions here? I know you're a Merchant Marine veteran from World War II. You're probably familiar somewhat with this story. Do you have any questions or comments here? You have to unmute yourself, Mark. And I wasn't sure if Leo West had a question. Leo, I saw your hand. Wasn't sure if that was a hand up or just waving to me. Okay. Hi, Leo. Happy New Year to you. Yeah, Mark. Mark is working on unmuting himself here. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. How you doing, Mark?
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Fine. I had to unmute my machine here. Sir Max, I was just wondering on the Ohio, and I read the book, Limping In. Did it have aviation gas or oil? I can't remember.
It was, in fact, it was oil. It was the aviation gas. Was all the other ships were carrying aviation gas in cans, but in fact I had quite a bit of trouble figuring it out, because a number of accounts of the time of people who participated said they were carrying aviation gas, but I finally got hold of the cargo manifest, and I found that actually it was oil fuel. But where I think what's implied in what you're saying, if it had had aviation gas on board, it would have gone up, because one or two of the other ships, which were carrying aviation gas, packed in cans on deck, when they were hit directly by German bombs, they just blew up. And that's what happens. But you obviously know more about that than I do.
Oh, no, not really. But what is really interesting when you have these attacks on these convoys, which go on for sometimes for a week or something like that, people are still eating and sleeping, and the people don't understand, what happens to the body after about 2 or 3 days. The alertness goes away. All navies sort of forbid alcohol aboard, although the British like to give a tot of rum now and then to get your spirit up. But I'm not sure how much of that keeps you going. So one of the things that people don't understand, that after about 2 or 3 days of somebody trying to shoot your head off, you still have to stay alert. And it's amazing when these convoys do come through.
You were so right, Mark. Although I have to say, having sailed on quite a number of American ships and so on, that I know that the rules always say that the ships are dry, but I found they can be quite wet also. But where were you yourself?
Pardon?
Where were you yourself?
I came in at the end of the war, and I was in most of the time in the Pacific for about a year. Yeah. So I didn't see any of the shooting, which was okay. But unfortunately, and we'll talk about this sometimes later, the United States government was really trying to increase their merchant marine. And fortunately for the British and the Canadians, they were one of the ones really put the convoy systems together. And most of their ships earlier in the war really got the convoys going. So if it hadn't been for the British and their knowledge of putting ships together. The Americans just did ships, but the British and Canadians knew how to put ships together. Thank you.
Well, it's nice of you to say so, but actually one of the things you touched on, which is very important, is one of my standing jokes when I'm writing about wars, is if you want to be a successful general or admiral, make sure you don't take command until your side are winning, until your side are stronger. And in fact, it was much when one looks at the guys who were in charge in the second half of the war, obviously it was easier for them because our side, the Western Allies, the United States above all, and the British and so on, were by then so much stronger than the others. But of course, in 1942, the best air cover that the British with 4 carriers could put up over pedestal was pathetic compared with the sort of air cover that United States fleets in the Pacific were able to put up in 1944-45. So it is a sort of, I think if I was allowed to choose my moment to be in any war, if you want to be a hero, it's better to be a hero when you make quite sure your side are winning, which they weren't in 1942 yet.
Yeah, the real heroes really were the ships really during the D-Day invasion. There were about 2,700 ships involved in the whole D-Day operation, and about 1,500 of these stayed on for 2 or 3 months because you had to get 2.5 million people from England over to the Europe seas. And people don't talk about those ships going back and forth, and being available to whatever air cover the Germans wanted to send in. So you're under constant stress. So the fact that these men could come through this was just amazing.
They did a fantastic job. Guys, I've got to love you and leave you now. But it was such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you very much for the privilege of sharing in your conversation. All the best, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Max. The privilege is ours. Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Thank you, Sir Max. All the best to you.
And to you. Happy 2022.
Okay. Okay, Todd, I think he's signed off. Is that
that is correct? And I'm boy, what a fascinating, boy, he knows his stuff, doesn't he?
Well, I'll tell you, in doing the research, a little bit of research on this before this interview, I told Todd I ran across a C-SPAN interview of Max Hastings done just towards the end of last year. It's the in-depth interviews they do on occasion, and it's a little over 2 hours, and it's about all of World War II. And if just Google C-SPAN Max Hastings, and in 2 hours you will learn more about World War II. The man is a fountain of knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I got the feeling that if you asked him, what did they serve for dinner, on the second to last day on the Ohio, he could tell you the menu, it's just amazing.
Yeah, very much. So that's, I got to tell you, of all the things I've done so far with VBC, that's my highlight is, it's like getting to interview Terry Bradshaw, if you're a Steeler fan.
A little bit more interesting, I think. Scott Masters, should we throw it to you? You've brought together with us some wonderful World War II veterans, and I thought you could introduce them.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Todd and Glenn. That was a real treat being able to hear Sir Max there this morning. So once again, I've been tasked, and I got to say really pleasantly so, tasked with the pleasure of bringing kind of the personal element of things to you guys this morning. In the course of my pretty long teaching career, 30 years now, I've been doing these oral history interviews with World War II vets for about a decade and a half or so, and I've come across a number of men who served in the Merchant Marine, and 3 of them are joining us here this morning. So I did want to welcome Ray Cameron, who is joining us from Toronto with his daughter Patty. We also have Hugh Brody, who is joining us from outside Montreal, and from way on the West Coast. He got up really early for us this morning morning, we got Percy Smith, who's joining us from outside Vancouver. So Percy, I thought I might begin with you, partly to recognize the fact that you got up so early for us this morning. I wanted to maybe ask you to share the story of what prompted you to join the Merchant Marine, and maybe you could begin by telling people, where you were when the war was underway.
Well, I was born in the island of Ceylon, which was then a British colony. My father was a colonial civil servant there. And so I grew up by the sea, and I spent all my time learning to swim, fish, and do things like that. And so, and I would see these ships on the horizon every day. And I wondered as to where they came from and where they went to. And so I grew up with these ships on the horizon. And when my time came to serve, one of the first things I said to myself, I'm going to be on one of the bloody ships and I'm going to see where the hell they go. And sure enough, I joined the Merchant Navy, hoping to see the world.
And I do have a great photo of you, so I'm just going to do a share screen here really quickly so that people have the opportunity to see what you look like back in the day. Let me just bring the correct image up there. So there we have Percy, a very young man. Obviously, this photo is a little bit more current, and I was really lucky with some students to be able to meet Percy last year. We had a great program at the school for many years where we would meet vets in person, of course. All that's changed pretty dramatically in the last year and a half, 2 years now. But we met Percy via Zoom call. You can see him here, and obviously this would be your photo registration, your identification, going back to the day. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about first, Percy, I mean, you literally saw the world during these years, but you also took part in the Murmansk convoys. And I was wondering if you could tell people how you got involved in the Arctic convoys.
Well, that was just an accident. I never knew where Murmansk was. When I got to Glasgow looking for my second ship, and when I got on the Empire, one of the Empire boats, and I tried to find out where the ship was going to, and somebody said, "Oh, it's a Murmansk run," and I thought, "Oh my gosh, it must be some exotic island in the Caribbean or something." And I thought, "Oh my God, that's just a ship for me. I need to get into safer waters." Little did I know that we ended up in the Orkney Islands, and I thought. And then we realized that we were on to Murmansk, and everybody said, you'll be damn lucky if you come back, because this is one of the most dangerous voyages you already signed on to. But there's nothing that you could do to sign off, because the next thing you knew, we were down in the Shetland Islands, joined a convoy, got to Bear Island, and from Bear Island, all hell broke loose from Bear Island to Murmansk. There was no sleep, morning, noon, and night. You spend your time on deck because you know what the hell you were going to get, either from a submarine or from the aircraft or from some destroyer somewhere, MSA. The worst part was the weather, MSA. It was the swells were anywhere between 20 and 30 feet. It's just mind-boggling as to how a sea could be so difficult. I mean, say, you were damn lucky if you were on deck and you didn't get washed, or you didn't get washed, because the sea was all over the bloody deck. There's no question about it. Fortunately, it was in October when I made the trip, so that we didn't have the ice on board. But I understand that if you went in February or March, the whole deck was coated with ice, and then you had to keep on breaking the ice because the ship would lose its balance. Yeah, but unfortunately, there was no Russian escorts. The Royal Navy at the time. Once we got to Bear Island, the Royal Canadian Navy took over, and they took us into Murmansk. What I understand later on was that the Royal Canadian Navy didn't lose a single escort ship in that run, which was quite remarkable, yeah.
Yeah, and let me do another share screen here just so people can get a sense of the location we are talking about. So we're obviously looking at the winter route and the summer route, and you mentioned Bear Island a couple of moments ago. And the conditions would have been absolutely incredible. You gave us a sense certainly of the kind of weather conditions that you were enduring. I remember, Percy, from talking to you in the past that you had a particularly powerful description of seeing a ship go down right in front of you. And I was wondering if you could share that story.
Well, we had 38 in that convoy. I was on a tank at the time. Of course, the tanker gets the first blow because of the fact that they don't want the oil to be delivered. But the first ship I saw was at 7 o'clock at night. We just saw the plume of smoke, and then all hell broke loose because the unfortunate thing about these convoys is they don't have ships at the same speed. You get a slower speed. The slower speed ships normally take the rear of the convoy, and the faster ships put them in front. So once the first ship gets hit, the convoy dissipates. So they go all over the bloody place. So you can hardly see a ship after a little while because the fact that you're more concerned about the saving your ship than doing much of that. We had the Royal Navy. We had the Royal Naval gunners on board, the Demon gunners, and they looked after the Beauforts and the Olicons. We had four Olicons on the bridge, and we had a Beaufort aft, and then we had a Beaufort forward. So, but the problem with the Beauforts was they can only reach high, but they can't reach low because of the fact that if you see a submarine, sometimes they can't reach a submarine because the gun can only go so low. So it was damn useless. They were good. They were good pieces of artillery, but unfortunately, they were good for aircraft and for nothing else. Yeah.
And I recall, Percy, you're telling me that your ship, you went past men in the water. Were you able to rescue anybody?
At that time, the order was that no ship was to pick up any survivors. And the only reason for that was because the fact of the height of the ships, you're looking at about 30 to 40 feet from the water to the top of the deck. But what happened was that after Germany occupied the Netherlands, most of the ships from the Netherlands came over to Britain, and they brought with them hundreds of seagoing tugs, ocean tugs. And they used these tugs as rescue ships because of the fact that they had a low deck and they could pick up people on the water. So on a voyage to Murmansk, we had two of these Dutch tugs. I think I told you a story about one of them got hit, and we were just behind them, and we slowed down, put the nets on the side, and we asked them to climb up. But there was this one guy, and he seemed to have only one hand. And one of the mates, one of the fellows on deck, the mates, he went down to give this guy a hand to come up the nets. And when he came on board, we found that he had a bloody cat on the other arm. But none of them survived. Both the cat, he was gone. They were gone in the next day. They both died of hypothermia. Yeah, you wouldn't last 10 minutes in the water, in the water. Yeah.
And you also had some interesting things to say, Percy, about the people of Murmansk. What do you remember about the people in that port city?
Well, Murmansk is about 20 kilometers from the ocean, and once you get into Murmansk port, it's about probably about a mile wide, and they had about 7 to 10 berths. And so you have to sometimes take your turn, waiting to get into the berth to discharge. But one of the problems with that was the German raiders, aircraft from Norway, would come over and they were raised hell because the ships were just sitting ducks in the middle of this, the middle of the harbor there. We only had one raid, and it was quite fabulous to see the shoguns taking these planes on. And then we realized that these guns were not by the harbor. They were way up on the hills. And the reason for that we found later on was they tried to get the planes before they got to the harbor. And one thing we also found out that all these artillery on these hills were all manned by women, not by men. And they were so good at it, and there wasn't a time that they would bring one or two of these planes down. The other thing I found out that when we went ashore was all the longshoremen were women. There was no men, and it's a huge, massive. I never seen women so big in my life as I saw these Russian women. But they did all the stevedoring. There was no men there. We saw a lot of children, maybe the children of these women, but it was quite dangerous to go ashore because they would rob you for a pair of boots was something that they were looking for, and so we didn't spend too much time getting into, because the harbor and the town are two separate things here.
That's just an incredible memory there, Percy. Thank you for sharing it. I want to introduce Ray Cameron now. And Todd, please let me know if anybody has a question or anything. You can keep your eye on the chat for me. But Ray, I was hoping you could come on there, and thank you so much to your daughter, Patty, for getting you all hooked up. And Ray, I would love to hear your story of what prompted you to join the Merchant Marine. You know, you're a teenage boy north of Toronto back when the war is going on. Why did you decide to get involved?
Well, first of all, Scott, I did not look forward to going through basic training, but my ambition was to sail. Now, going back to that, like in the Merchant Navy, it was like an apprenticeship. You start at the bottom and work your way up. Now, in the Navy, you got probably too much or more of basic training. The Merchant Navy, you could sign up on a ship today and be at sea the next day. I could have been maybe 2 trips overseas by the time these other gentlemen graduated. And by this time, the war is settling down, and we could see it was coming to an end. But I did manage to I made 9 return trips during the war, and nothing, the war was winding down. Our escorts were much better, and fortunately, I did not witness any attacks at sea. I was in an air raid in Naples, which was pretty scary. And
we'll have you talk about that one in just a moment, Ray, because it's a fantastic story. I want to do a really quick share screen, Ray, just to show people what you looked like back at the time. And here we go. There's Ray manning the helm. And I've known Ray for quite a long time. He lives in Toronto. You can see that he's one of the veterans who's actually been able to come to my classroom. We haven't been able to do that for quite a while. And a great newspaper article here there, Ray, about your joining up. So, Ray, I was hoping you could tell the story of the connection to Norway, because you sailed for the Norwegian Merchant Navy, as it happens.
Yes, I did, and I was very fortunate to get aboard Norwegian ships, because Norway was a maritime nation, and that was the livelihood. Norway, probably next to Britain, had the largest merchant fleet afloat during or pre-war. As a fact, Norway lost 600 ships in World War II. And their ships were always tip-top shape. They were the envy of anybody else that had to sail on other ships. You could pick a Norwegian ship out of the convoy because of the maintenance and the condition of it. and the conditions were good on it. And the Norwegian people, I've gained a great respect for all of the Scandinavians because we blended right in. And how we got aboard the Norwegian ships, Norway had this massive fleet at sea, but naturally they were short crews. And I was, as a young lad, I was sailing on the Great Lakes, and Norway had permission to recruit seamen off the Great Lakes, which that one picture shows. And I thought, well, a little bit of adventure, you know, I'm only 17, what the heck. So I joined up on Wellington Street, right here in Toronto. And 2 or 3 days later, this is back in November in 43. Next thing we know, we're at 88 Broad Street, New York. 2 days later, you would see. It's as simple as that.
And the first ship that you were on, that was the Talisman, correct, Ray? Okay, I'll bring a picture of the ship up and a picture of the crew, and maybe you could share a couple of memories of what life was like on the Talisman, what the conditions were, maybe a little bit about the other crew. And I should point out, Ray is right in the back of the group photo. We got a nice close up there in front. So what was it like on the Talisman, Ray?
It was a beautiful group of people. There's, of course, this is in Brooklyn, New York, this picture. And all the Norwegians, of course, had all the girlfriends there. It was a big party. It's supposed to be a football anniversary or a celebration that we won some championship. I don't know when it happened, but it worked out that way. Any excuse, I guess, for a party. And, as you can look through there, most of us do look like Scandinavians, including myself. That's probably why I blended in with them. But I couldn't have wished to travel with a better group of people. I was accepted as one of them. So therefore, as I say, I have a lot of respect for Scandinavians. Yeah.
And what were the conditions like on the ship itself? What was your job within the crew?
Well, I made 2 trips on that ship. Of course, I mentioned previously, you got to start at the bottom. I was galley boy on my first trip, but I wanted to get it on deck. So then I became an ordinary seaman. I made 1 trip on the ship. That's one I paid off at when I got back to New York as an ordinary seaman. And then I graduated from there and got on a Norwegian tanker. And I was on it for probably 10 months. And that was running into the Mediterranean, bringing fuel in. I probably documented that earlier on in one of our conversations. But we would load up mostly in Port Amboy, New Jersey. And we would end up at Gibraltar, and we'd double up on our gun crew, and then put a barrage balloon on it. And then we proceed over to Italy. And we start off at Bari, Italy, and the Asiatic side there. And we stopped off, we had aviation, 80 and octane gas aboard. And we stopped off at the various little airports that are around the heel of Italy. And by the time we get up to Naples or even up to Livorno, we're empty and we come back. One of those trips would take approximately 2 months by the time we distribute all our fuel. And that got to be a routine. As I say, I made 5 trips on that ship. It's that same routine. Of course, at the end of the war, they were easing off on the escorts. I think the last trip I made on her, we didn't have any escorts after we left Gibraltar. So excuse me for that.
Yeah, and as I recall, Ray, you mentioned a couple of locations there. Of course, your time in Naples, you had the misfortune of being there when that big air raid took place. I'd love to hear you reminisce a little bit about that. What do you remember about that air raid in Naples?
Well, it happened around midnight, and it was calm. There wasn't noise at all. Pitch black, of course. And all of a sudden, the anti-aircraft was opening up. And it lasted probably about no more than 5 minutes. But with the anti-aircraft batteries putting up such a barrage, there was no damage that I was aware of in the raid. It's funny. I was over the hall in, I guess, 2:15. With a group of veterans. And I was riding one of the Army trucks at Appledorn, and this one chap there noticed I had the Italian star. He said, "Oh, you were in Italy?" I said, "Yes, I was." He said, "Did you see any action?" I said, "Well, I was in an air raid in Naples." He said, "You were?" He said, "Well, I was in an air raid in Naples too." He said, "I was on a troop ship being transferred over to France at the time because we were pulling most of the troops out of Italy. And I assume maybe him and I were in that same raid. But we didn't have much more of a conversation after that. But it's just a coincidence that he'd also been in an air raid at the same time. Yeah.
And you also mentioned, Ray, Gibraltar. And I remember you having a really powerful story about one of the ships in your convoy just outside of Gibraltar.
That was coming back. We're all empty. I think we're going up off the coast of Spain. And the ship ahead of us, well, we're just more or less forming the convoy after coming out of the Straits. And the ship ahead of us either struck a mine, or I don't think it was torpedoed because there was too much air cover around there anyways at the time. And it was just unfortunate. This ship, we were right behind it. The guys were coming up from down below, and it was a complete inferno. And the guys were just coming up there, well, I guess panicky too, follow the leader, jumping over the side, in the North Atlantic, and it's pretty damn cold. And I recall these guys, it was kind of surreal. The guys were floating in the water, both sides of us, but you could not stop in a convoy to pick any of them up, And that haunted me for the longest time, although it was like a bad dream. Yeah. So that was that experience. So that was the most action that I had seen in World War II. Yeah.
I think that's quite enough. I remember your sharing that story with the students during Remembrance Day, and it gave them a pretty strong insight into what you guys had to go through. And as I always remind my students, you guys were all effectively the age they are right now. And once they begin to understand that, I think learning about World War II just has that much more of an impact on them. So, Ray, I'm going to go on and say good morning to Hugh here for a couple of moments, and we'll come back to you in a little bit. So Hugh is joining us from outside Montreal. So Hugh, let me say good morning, bonjour. Oh, and Hugh, you just have to unmute yourself there, please.
How's that?
Very, very good. So good morning. So nice of you to join us. And Hugh, I know that you, of course, joined the Merchant Navy towards the end of the war also, while you were in Montreal. Why did you decide to get involved? You were just a teenager too.
Yes, I was. I'd just finished first year at college, and I hadn't enjoyed it very much. Most of my friends were in the service. But I was a little too young. At that time, the Air Force and the Navy and the Army would not take you till your 18th birthday. and I was a year younger than that. And one day somebody related to my mother that I could get into the merchant marine. They weren't that particular about ages. And so I went to, and she had the particulars. I went to the shipping master's office in Montreal and signed on as a mess boy on a ship. And we sailed out of Montreal 48 hours later. So it was a very rapid entry into.
Yeah, exactly like Ray was describing his experience.
Yeah.
So I imagine you would have been one of the youngest guys on the crew. Did they treat you well, your shipmates?
Yes, I was the youngest guy. Indeed, I was. I was teased somewhat for a while, but after a month, you blend in with everybody else, and it was okay.
And I'm going to do a really quick share screen here, Hugh, just to give people an idea of what you looked like back in the day. Let me go ahead and do that now. So there we have Hugh on the cover of his memoir that he wrote for his family. And we met Hugh via Zoom, of course, last year as well. And that was a real highlight. It was one of the very first ones we did when I sort of started this whole venture of trying to meet World War II veterans in this way. Hugh, I thought that you had a really interesting story about what you did in the event of the crew teasing you. You had one of the older guys on the crew teach you how to become a boxer.
Yes, the ship's carpenter was an Englishman from Plymouth, and he had been a professional boxing instructor in Plymouth, and he would the people in an area of Toronto called, there is a park called the West End, I understand, called Bellwoods Park. And our ship, like the majority of Canadian merchant ships, were named after parks or forts. Mine was called Bellwoods Park. And I found out only long after the war that Bellwoods Park was in the West End of Toronto. And the people of that area in 1944 had gotten together and purchased some boxing equipment, and they donated it to the crew of the ship named after their park. So our ship had a lot of boxing gloves, a big bag, smaller punching bag, the usual paraphernalia that a boxer uses to learn. And no, I was the only fellow who was interested in this, and the ship's carpenter and I got together, and he put me on a regimen to learn to box. And in various ports that we would land, if there was a boxing match on, they were very common in Britain at that time amongst servicemen. And my first such match was in Salford, a suburb of Manchester. And the boxing match took place in Trafford Park, where Manchester United plays football, famous place. And that was my first boxing match. But I trained on the ship with the ship's carpenter every day, day after day after day. It was a lot of fun, really, and it filled in the time because one has a lot of spare time on the ship, I found.
So I have to ask you, what happened to you in that first match? Did you win?
Yes, I did win by default because my opponent was disqualified. I was 17 and he was 21. That's a big difference for boxers. And he also had 4 years of experience. He was a private in the British Army. And he gave so many foul blows to me that I was awarded the child. Not a very good way.
Well, we're not going to count it as a TKO or whatever. A win is a win as far as we're concerned. Yeah, and you were 1-0. So, and you mentioned the name of your ship. It was called the Bellwoods. It was what we called in Canada a park ship, but for Americans who are listening, essentially the same thing as a Liberty ship. The ship that you served on was the Bellwoods, and my colleague and I discovered. We actually knew there's a brewery in Toronto called the Bellwoods Brewery. So we got Hugh a sweatshirt from them, and we sent that up to him. Yeah.
And you
Of
see my
course, we
sweatshirt?
yeah, absolutely. We saw it there. And of course, we bought beer for ourselves. We couldn't send that to you, though. That would be too heavy in Canada Post. So that we kept for ourselves. But we are very happy to be able to send that up to you. So on the ship, Hugh, you mentioned your duties, of course, as the mess boy and the training and so forth. What kind of cargoes were you hauling at that point in the war?
It was the spring of 1944. We were taking tanks, a lot of artillery pieces, and a great deal of ammunition, and a lot of rolling stock like ambulances, trucks. After D-Day, and a lot of trucks were needed to bring the stuff forward to the armies as they advanced eastward into France and Germany. So we had a lot of that, and then the ship was filled with grain to fill in the loose parts. And it was mostly war material and grain.
Okay, and you mentioned, Hugh, that you never, had to deal with an attack yourself, but I understand that you had a role within the gun crew in case that were to happen.
Yes, all of us did that. I was assigned to the 4-inch gun on the stern of the ship as an ammunition passer, and I would pass the shell to another fella who would lift it up and pass it to another, and finally it would go to the loader at the gun. There were 2 people on the gun, a trainer who moved it sideways and another who moved it up and down.
How often would you guys have to do practice?
Oh, it happens sporadically, every 3 or 4 weeks, at the discretion of the captain, or the convoy director, convoy commander.
And I know one of the favorite questions, of course, for anybody who served in the Navy, I think at any point, not just World War II, is the question of weather. And I understand that you guys sailed through a hurricane one time.
We did, and it was very short of ballast. An empty ship needs ballast to hold it down in the water. And of course, going eastward, our ship was loaded down with heavy right to the maximum, but coming home it would be empty, and all ships would need ballast. And in North Africa, the ballast for us, it could not be obtained. It had all been used up by American ships and others, and there was none. And thus we did get into a hurricane, and that was my last journey home. Actually, we landed in St. John, New Brunswick, eventually, and I came home from there.
That's probably a perfect time to complete your last journey, having dealt with weather like that. Let me go back to Percy for a moment. Percy, if I recall, once you finished with the Arctic convoys, you ended up signing on with a Liberty ship as well. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, but before I do that, I want to tell you about a boxing story that I have. When we were in Singapore, which is just after the war, Singapore had a lot of entertainment, and they had these 3 entertainment centers: the Great World, Small World, and something else. And one of the features in this was they had a boxing. Their competition, and the competition was anybody from the audience had to take on this professional boxer. And if he could last for 3 minutes, he got $10. And $10 is a heck of a lot of money. And being as merchant seamen, we got paid pittance. So if you get a $10 bill for that night, my gosh, we could have had all the girls and all the liquor we could have had. Anyhow, but this guy in the ring didn't know that we had a professional boxer on board. So when we got there and we heard about this boxing tournament, we decided to send our friend on. We never told them what this guy's background was. So what happened was the guy they put the gloves on the guy, the sailor, and for a couple of seconds he feigned as if he didn't know how to box. But after about a minute, he gave this guy a thrashing. You won't believe. The crowd was so ecstatic. He had this guy running around in circles, and he eventually nearly knocked this guy out, threw in the towel and took the guy out. We got our $10, and boy, did we have a bloody good time that evening. Well, that's my boxing story. Anyhow, to go back, when I did my trip to the Mermans, I decided to go AWOL because I've had it, because I had about close to 30 years service in the Navy, and I didn't know when the hell to get out. And after a couple of weeks, when I had gone into London and I came back home, I was told by my sister, there was a policeman to see you. And I knew exactly what it was all about, because this guy was in search of me because I had not shown up. So I took the train to Southampton, and I joined the Cromwell, which was a Liberty ship. And before I signed on, and now I was a smart guy because the fact I knew exactly what I was going to do. And I spoke to one of the officers and I said, where's she headed for? And he said, oh, we're going down to the Far East. And I said, oh, that seems good for me. Any chance of signing on? And he said, yeah. What's your background? And I told him that I was a mess boy. I was a steward. I was a chief steward. And I said, I also have my ticket for a deck officer. And he said, well, we're looking for the chief steward. Would you like to take it on? I said, yeah, I'll take it on. So we left Southampton. We had a convoy to Gibraltar, which was nothing. The only problem was when we got to the Bay of Biscay, the weather was so bad. I didn't realize that I was told later on that the bay is one of the worst oceans to be in at any time of the year. But we got to Gibraltar and managed to get through the Mediterranean into Djibouti, where we unloaded a load of oil and then went ballast to Alexandria. And while we were there, we were told that we were going to join, we were designated as the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. So we became part of the RFA. And so we were under this Admiralty orders. And we went through the Red Sea, ended up in Abadan, got a load of bunker C, and then we learned that we were going to go to join the 3rd British Fleet in Trincomalee, Ceylon, and be part of the invasion fleet for the liberation of Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. And that's what happened. We eventually, in early 45, we were down in Trincomalee, where there was about 200 ships, floatage of ships, and Dutch, American, Canadian, Indian, Belgian, and the US. And we couldn't get into to Rangoon, but we were anchored in the Andaman Islands in because that was the most safest harbor. I think that it was Port Blair in the Andaman Islands, and the ships would come, and they would all get serviced up by them. And while we were in the Andaman Islands, we heard about this great American bomb that had been dropped on Nagasaki, and it had killed about 200,000 to 300,000 people. And we just, oh my gosh, the bloody memory. And the Americans, they can really blow a story. And then, of course, 2 or 3 days later, they dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki, and then we knew that that there must be some truth to that. And then a few days later, we heard that the war was over. So we went into Rangoon, and that was a shambles. From Rangoon, we got into the to Penang, which is in the Straits of Sumatra. And from Sumatra, from Penang, we went to Singapore. Singapore had not been liberated yet because the Japanese didn't know that the war was over. So I think there was two battleships, two troop ships there, and they put the troops in, and took about 15 days for them to shorten that. And we spent close to 2 months doing nothing, just anchored off the Singapore harbor, waiting for something to happen now that the war was over, and they even hadn't paid us off. So fortunately, we were still getting paid. And eventually, they handed the ship over under the Lend-Lease Act to the Chinese nationalists. And so they put a Chinese crew on board, and we got paid off. And
that's pretty remarkable. And sorry, forgive me for interrupting there, Percy. We are getting into our last couple minutes. I wanted to do another quick share screen to let everybody know exactly what you look like by this period of time. Let me just go ahead and bring that up really quickly. There we are. And I wasn't able to find a picture of the Cromwell, unfortunately, but this is, a pretty typical shot of a Liberty ship that you would see. And this is you on board with some of your fellow crewmates, and of course here too after the war is over, and including that absolutely wonderful.
That's it in London, yeah. Yeah, and
just really quickly, are there any questions coming up at all, Todd?
Those three, the three of us there, those two of my shipmates from the Cromwell, they both passed away now, and in fact, that was taken at the Tower Bridge for one of the Merchant Navy these reunions, but unfortunately, both have passed away now. Yeah.
And I thought we should end. It doesn't seem, Todd, like there's any questions in the chat that I see right now.
No, I don't see any questions either.
One of the really important issues to bring up with you guys, and this is just as true for the American Merchant Marine, was the very delayed recognition of your service. So, Ray, I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about that, how you had to fight for so many years to get your service recognized.
That's true, Scott. I don't know whether the government was just avoiding their responsibilities or what, but anyhow, we really never got any recognition until 1995, I think it was, after lots of battles with the Canadian Seamen's Union was eliminated. That was a representative. Then we got into other seafaring organizations. Canadian Seamen's Association, I think it was, run by a chap out west. What the heck was his name? This gentleman that I was talking to, remember? Yes, Bruce Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And here in Toronto too, we had the League of Merchant Navies representatives. And between the two organizations, we finally got a settlement with the government. But if you don't mind, I'd like to bring up listening to this other gentleman about being caught in a hurricane. The tanker that I was on had a skeleton deck aboard it to carry airplanes. And we had a load of P-38s and Mustangs heading for Europe. And we got into one heck of a storm. A tanker, being a tanker loaded, it lays low in the water. By the time we got to Europe, there was nothing really left of those planes that they could salvage. So that was my experience of being in a very vicious storm. And fortunately, the tanker, it rides okay, but all the seas are going right over it, and probably taking a piece of an airplane with it when it did it. So that was quite an experience too. So anyhow, yes, I really don't have any other questions.
Well, I'm glad to know, Ray, that you guys did eventually get that recognition. It's so unfortunate that for all three of you gentlemen, it was something that literally took 50 years, but that's the reality of what was happening. I do see somebody with their hand up, Todd, if we have time
Saul,
for a
yeah,
question.
Saul. Hi, Saul. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Saul Naiman. I happen to be a Holocaust survivor who spent 5.5 years in a forced labor camp in the Soviet Union. We were deported from Poland to the Soviet Union. And we were in a place called Syktyvkar, which happens to be about 650 kilometers from Archangel, or Arkhangelsk, as it was called in Russian, and about 2,000 kilometers from Murmansk. Now, the one thing that we did not know anything about in the Soviet Union is what was happening in the other part of the world. For example, the Battle of Malta. We knew nothing about that. We knew nothing about what was going on in the Atlantic. But we did learn about the convoys that did land equipment in Murmansk and in Archangel. And all I want to do is say how grateful I am to have survived the war, to have survived the Nazi atrocities of the Holocaust, and how grateful I am to you, Percy and Ray and Hugh and others who saved the world and saved us. And I want to thank Scott most sincerely. I spoke at Scott's class about 5 years ago, and this is just a wonderful opportunity for someone like me to learn a little more about the courage and the heroism of so many people. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I wish you Godspeed and just be well. It's a privilege for me to have been part of the audience today, and I thank you very, very much.
Yeah, Scott, could I say something about the Merchant Navy before we close?
Thank you for joining, Saul.
Yeah. Scott, I would like to say something. When the negotiations with the Canadian government were going on for the recognition of the Canadian Merchant Navy as veterans, I was chairman of the Merchant Navy organization in Vancouver at the time. And we had about close on 600 merchant seamen who were members. And all that negotiation that was going on, we had a representative from Vancouver on that board. And the settlement was pittance. You won't believe what I'm going to tell you. The maximum anybody could have got out of that settlement was $20,000. And it all depended that if you had full service during the war, you got the $20,000. But that was prorated according to your service. So if you had 6 months service, you only got a couple of $1,000. So nobody got the $20,000 as they had promised. That was the promise that was made by the government, that everybody was going to get 20,000. But when it came to shelling up the money, then they prorated the money. And I got to tell you this, but bringing a British seaman, I got bugger all. I got nothing. It's only now that I get some benefits from Veterans Canada. It's only now, in the last few years. But I got no settlement from that. For all the work that I did in helping the Canadians to get that money, I got nothing. That's it.
Unfortunate. Todd, I want to.
Scott, I know that your internet
Sandhu,
connection.
I want to give my thanks to. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I might be fading in and out a bit. I'm getting that internet instability note, but I wanted to thank you and Glenn for letting us be involved. I mean, this was a fantastic program. Ray, Hugh, and Percy, thank you so much to all of you guys. It's great to be able to visit with you again too.
Ray, Hugh, and Percy, thank you so much. Saul, thank you for just sharing a little bit of your gratitude and your story. I'm going to get in touch with you and ask if you could come on and share more of your story, just like I'm going to ask Mark Gleason to come on and talk more about his experiences in the Merchant Marine. Howard Pfeiffer, who Mark knows, also is Merchant Marine veteran. I'd love to do more on the Merchant Marine, especially this issue of the non-recognition and the fight for recognition in Canada and in the United States. Mark, you've been involved in that just like Percy has. And so thank you all for joining us today. Glenn, thank you for handling Sir Max. That was a wonderful program. What a fascinating morning. I feel like just a privilege just to have spent the time with you all. All right, take care, and I hope to see you again. Everybody have a good Monday. See you tonight at 7 p.m. with F4 fighter Larry Guggens, F4 pilot, Vietnam. You better be there. All right, take care.
This-